I can't leave my mother alone. I'm worried about my father. Can you please drive? Take us to the hospital, I pleaded. Bob stared at me for a moment, then nodded. All right, he said quietly, starting to prepare. Thank you, I replied gratefully, hurrying to get ready as well. Together, we headed to the hospital in Bob's car. As we drove deeper into the woods, Bob suddenly pulled over. Something doesn't feel right with the car. I'm sorry, could you check the front tire? He asked. I stepped out, closing the door behind me. As I inspected the tire, confusion struck me. Wait, what are you doing? I called out as Bob started the car without letting me back in. He quickly pulled onto the opposite lane, tossing my bag out of the window towards me. That's for waking me up in the middle of the night. Bob smirked, speeding away and disappearing from sight in moments. 2 hours later, I arrived at the hospital to find Bob critically injured. My name is Catherine Thompson, 24 years old. After graduating from college, I worked at a major corporation until I met Bob, a senior colleague whom I eventually married. Bob was charming, intelligent, and athletic, a dream man for many. I had admired him from afar, like many of my female coworkers, imagining what it would be like to be close to him. The thrill of seeing him in the office or being chosen for a project he led was exhilarating. Then, unexpectedly, Bob approached me after I was transferred to his department. It started with work discussions, but soon we were spending more time together. Before long, we were dating, and soon after, we were married. I had adored Bob to the heavens, but there was always a lingering question in my mind. Why me? When he proposed, I couldn't help but ask, Bob, why did you choose me? His smile was warm as he replied, because you loved me the most. It embarrassed me, yet filled me with joy to hear that. It felt like validation, as if he truly understood and accepted the depth of my feelings. However, after we were married, Bob's reason seemed to shift. He once said to me, I married you because you were my #1 fan. You saw how great I am and made the right choice. It sounded similar, yet somehow different. I couldn't quite grasp it at the time, but as the years passed, that discomfort solidified into something I couldn't ignore. If only I had understood it sooner, perhaps I wouldn't have endured so much. Bob seemed perfect on the surface as long as I didn't upset him. After we married and started living together, I noticed a change. He became increasingly critical of me over small things, like the consistency of breakfast eggs or the ironing of his shirts. Sometimes, he'd unexpectedly quiz me on complex topics, disappointed if I couldn't provide a satisfactory answer. Whether it was about morning routines, prompt responses to messages, the strength of coffee, or even a single hair in the sink, Bob would meticulously point out every detail. His voice remained calm, but each word felt deliberate, ensuring I understood his dissatisfaction. Listen, he would say, I'm telling you this for your own good, so you could be a wife who reflects well on me and doesn't embarrass herself in front of others. If you just follow my instructions, you won't go wrong. This routine repeated itself until I would relent with, yes, I understand. I'm sorry, I was wrong. Once he sensed my genuine remorse, he'd dismissively say, all right, just be more careful next time. I found myself constantly tiptoeing around him. Day and night, I monitored Bob's moods, kept the house impeccable, and served flawless meals. Avoiding his criticism consumed my thoughts entirely. As my awareness grew, Bob would comment, Catherine, appearance matters. Lately, you look so tired. What would people think? Always present yourself well as my wife. He insisted on buying me expensive clothes, makeup, and spa treatments. Ironically, money was the least of my concerns, thanks to Bob's wealth. I strained to maintain my appearance to his standards, and in return, I heard comments like, Catherine, you're so lucky to have such a wonderful husband. I envy you. I wish my spouse were like Bob. Oh, how I wish I could trade places with you. I might have echoed those sentiments from an outsider's view, but the reality was a living nightmare. If only someone could trade places with me, I wished desperately. Desperately following Bob's orders, 2 years slipped by unnoticed. Beneath my smiling facade, I felt myself slowly fading away. Then, one night, my smartphone shattered the silence with its shrill ringtone, jolting me back to reality. I snatched up the phone, casting a quick glance at Bob, who stirred irritably beside me. It was my mom calling. Hello? What's wrong? Oh, Catherine, it's your father. Mom's voice trembled over the line. My dad had suffered a heart attack and was in surgery. What? Dad. Her sobs pierced through the phone. I understand. I'm on my way. I hung up and turned to Bob, urgency in my voice. It's my dad. I need to go to the hospital. Can you drive me? Bob stared at me in silence. Surely, even Bob would recognize the gravity of the situation. Though I had a license, I wasn't allowed to drive his car. I can't leave my mom alone. I'm really worried about Dad. Please, can you drive me to the hospital? After a tense moment, Bob finally nodded, getting up to dress. Thank you. I hurriedly prepared myself, and we set off to the hospital in Bob's car. The hospital was only 7 to 8 miles away, a 10 to 15-minute drive down the main road. However, Bob chose to take a shortcut through a side road. It's late. This way should be quicker, he explained. Okay, I replied, grateful that Bob was trying to get me to the hospital swiftly. Despite his tough exterior, I believed deep down he cared for me. As we drove through the side road, surrounded by trees, I remembered Bob mentioning how scenic this route was during our drives. Suddenly, Bob pulled the car over. The car seems off. Can you check the front tire? He asked abruptly. I stepped out and closed the passenger door behind me. But then, to my surprise, Bob started the car without me inside. It moved a short distance forward, then reversed, turned around, and returned to where I stood, bewildered. I have an important presentation tomorrow, and now I've been woken up at this hour, Bob muttered irritably. He parked on the opposite side of the road, hurried towards me, and tossed my bag out through the open window. That's your punishment for waking me up in the middle of the night, Bob sneered, his expression unsettling. With that, he sped off in the original direction, disappearing from view in moments. The location was a secluded spot in a not-so-deep forest, and the time was nearing 2 a.m. Normally, one would feel helpless and might even cry in such a situation, but somehow, I felt relieved. In the pitch-black forest, I walked straight towards the hospital, a distance of about 6 miles. All I could think about was reaching my parents as quickly as possible. I couldn't care less about Bob's angry face. I wouldn't mind if I never saw him again. When he threw my bag at me, I almost broke down in tears, wondering why he would do such a thing. Did I mess up again? Did I upset Bob? I should apologize quickly. But I couldn't think of what to apologize for. What on earth had I done wrong? Bob, in his callousness, provided the answer. It's punishment for waking me up in the middle of the night. If I had woken Bob for some trivial reason, it would be my fault. But my father was in critical condition, undergoing emergency surgery, and my mother was anxiously waiting at the hospital. Bob didn't care about my need to be with them as soon as possible. To him, his work tomorrow was more important than anything else. Even if he didn't care about my feelings or my parents, he could have just told me to go to the hospital alone. Instead, he pretended to drive me there, then lied and left me stranded in the dark forest. Such actions were beyond normal. It was a rude awakening for me. When I first met Bob, I imagined him as a prince from a fairy tale, and marrying him felt like living that dream. But that dream turned into a nightmare. The real-life prince was nothing but a selfish person. It was all about him. He even admitted that the reason he married me was because I was his biggest admirer. In other words, he chose the easiest person to manipulate, all to satisfy his ego. I thought I was loved and chosen by Bob and tried my hardest to be a good wife to him. But now I don't care anymore. In that forest, I found my freedom. I can't go back to that cage anymore, and I have no intention to. What did I even find appealing in such a superficial person who doesn't even seem human? As I hurried through the forest, these thoughts ran through my mind. After about 2 hours of walking, I finally reached the hospital. At the emergency entrance, I informed the staff that my father had been brought in by ambulance and was undergoing surgery. The security guard checked the name I provided and asked me to sign the visitors list. Once done, he handed me a visitor's badge. I put it around my neck and rushed to the central operation room where my mom was waiting. The only sound echoing in the dimly lit corridor was the click-clack of my heels. 2 hours had passed since then. I wondered how my dad was doing and how my mom was holding up. Naturally, I quickened my pace. The exhaustion from the long walk seemed to vanish. After turning a few corners, I saw my mom sitting under a dim light on a sofa. Mom. Catherine. As I called out to her, she looked up with tears streaming down her face. My heart sank. Is something wrong with Dad? I sat down next to her on the sofa, and she said, No. I just felt relieved seeing your face. Your dad is still in surgery. You startled me. I felt a rush of blood from my heart, and all my strength drained away. After waiting a bit longer, the lights in the operating room finally went off. We were informed by the surgeon that the operation was successful. It would take some time for his condition to stabilize, but for now, the danger had passed. My mother and I shed tears of relief together. My father was taken to the ICU on a stretcher. He was still asleep, but I was truly relieved to see his face resting peacefully. Together with my mother, we followed to the ICU and watched over him as he was transferred to his bed. Now, there's nothing more we can do. We're just waiting for Dad to wake up and recover. I need to make sure Mom gets some rest. The 2 hours before I arrived must have been so lonely for her. Thinking about it made me angry at Bob. I took Mom to the vending machine area and bought her a warm tea. Here, drink this to calm down, I said, handing her the tea. Thank you. My mother opened a can of coffee and took a sip, seeming to finally calm down. Seeing her relax made me feel better too. As we sat in the coffee area before dawn, a nurse approached us. Excuse me, are you Catherine Thompson, wife of Bob Thompson? Oh yes, that's me. The nurse had seen the name I filled out in the visitor's book and wondered if it might be me. Last night around 2 a.m., your husband was brought in by ambulance. We tried contacting the number your husband provided multiple times, but we couldn't reach you. I hurriedly took out my phone from my bag. When I got in the car, I had muted it, thinking I'd be at the hospital shortly. I remembered setting it that way, not wanting to waste any time adjusting settings when I got to the hospital. I saw several missed calls from an unknown number, which turned out to be this hospital's. Bob must have thought that I wouldn't go to the hospital and would just follow him home, so he provided both our home and my mobile number. He probably never imagined that I, left alone in the woods in the middle of the night, would walk over 6 miles to the hospital. I explained that my father was also being treated here, apologized for missing the calls, and inquired about Bob's condition. Apparently, after leaving me behind, Bob had an accident on his way home. He's alive, but both his legs are broken and he needs surgery. That's why they had been trying to reach me. I asked my mother to wait while I went to see Bob. It's quite something, having both your husband and father in here at the same time, the nurse said to me with a sympathetic look. But I'd only felt sorry for my father. I could have cared less about what happens to Bob. Of course, I have no intention of taking care of him. However, there was no need to say such things to someone who didn't know the situation, so I just smiled vaguely. By some stroke of luck, Bob was having surgery in the operating room next to my father's, and he was in a private room near the ICU. There was a nameplate at the room entrance that read, Mr. Bob Thompson. It's the best private room, and apparently it was Bob's request. I entered the room with the nurse who had shown me the way. Bob was suspended with both legs immobilized, looking utterly pitiable. As he tried to speak to me, he realized I wasn't alone and said, I'm sorry for putting you through this, especially with your father in such a state. I'm glad you came, nurse. I apologized for the trouble, with a forced smile. When the nurse left and we were alone, Bob's face took on that lecturing look he always had. Where the hell have you been? Why didn't you answer the phone right away? I've been stuck here, struggling. Tell me, where have you been? He demanded in an accusatory tone. Where do you think? You told me my father had surgery, right? Obviously, I was at the hospital. Bob looked genuinely shocked by my response. What's with that tone? Haven't I always told you to speak politely and gracefully? I won't tolerate such language, he chastised, quickly regaining his composure. He still seemed to think he had the upper hand. Why should I be so polite to you? To someone who deceived me and left me in a forest in the middle of the night? I don't feel the need to show such consideration. What did you say? Bob glared at me, saying, Is that how you address your master? In a calm yet restrained voice full of anger. Master, I see. He's always thought of himself that way. His attitude wasn't that of a husband to a wife, but of a master to a servant. But I'm not a servant anymore. I reclaimed myself in that forest, I confidently retorted. I don't have a master. I'm a free person. Seeing my firm stance, Bob's face contorted in visible anger. Is that what someone who's been taken care of should say? Well, is that what someone who's been cared for should say? What? Perhaps shocked by my words, Bob jerked, causing pain in his immobilized legs and letting out a cry of pain. I coldly looked down at Bob, his legs fixed in place, unable to do anything, his face twisted in pain and drenched in sweat. Guess you got what was coming to you, I said, a chuckle naturally following my words. I laughed, and Bob cried. The roles had reversed. The thought made me laugh even harder. What's so funny? It's all your fault I'm in this mess. Don't you feel guilty? Bob asked cheerfully but still defiant. My fault? No, I think it's someone who left his wife in a forest and hurried home. Serves you right, I countered. Bob looked at me in disbelief, a mix of shock and fear in his eyes. His wife, who had always been obedient and looked up to him with admiration, was now confronting him with cold words and glances as if he were a stranger. He looked disturbed, his eyes darting around. I realized he was just a small, insignificant man. I felt ashamed for having feared and acted so subserviently to this man for so long. We should break up, I spoke firmly. I don't see any point in being married to you anymore. I'll wait until you're discharged from the hospital, so please prepare yourself. In the meantime, I'll pack up our stuff at home. Don't be ridiculous. I'm never gonna leave you. Do you realize how much time and effort I've put into this relationship? Bob winced in pain as he moved, became silent, tears distorting his face. Do you have anything else to say? If you do, now's the time. What will it be? Despite my words, Bob just continued to cry, unable to respond. Nothing then. All right, I have to go care for my father. Take care and goodbye. I left the room, leaving Bob groaning in pain. Later that day, my father woke up. Holding hands with my mother, tears of joy streamed down our faces. Although it would take time for him to be discharged from the ICU and be mobile, it was a relief to know he was stable. I returned to my family home with my mom and shared my decision to divorce Bob. My mother was initially shocked, but after hearing my side of the story, she nodded in silence and welcomed me back home. She never imagined that her daughter, who she believed was living happily, was being treated so poorly. I never told my parents the truth, trying to present a facade of a happy marriage. I even tried to convince myself that I was a happy wife. I cried at my mother's understanding and for making them worry. I wept and wept until I began preparations for the next step. First, I started looking for a lawyer experienced in divorce cases. This was surprisingly easy because a friend of mine worked at a law firm. I met with a few lawyers and decided on a female attorney who had assisted many women like me suffering from their husband's emotional abuse. I gained an experienced and powerful ally. While Bob was in the hospital, I organized my belongings and prepared to leave the house. The challenge was to prove Bob's fault, but surprisingly, this was easily settled. When Bob had an accident and was questioned by the police, he told them, I had an accident on my way back from dropping off my wife at the hospital, where she wanted to be with her father, who was being operated on after an emergency. However, his story seemed off. After all, I arrived at the hospital 2 hours after Bob's accident. When asked where he was and what he was doing during that time, I honestly told them everything, including being abandoned in the forest late at night. At first, the police were just shocked, but as they listened, they began to suspect it was malicious abandonment. Many people, not just the police but also those involved with insurance, his company, and others, eventually found out the truth. Bob kept making mistakes, and for that, I'm grateful. In this way, I was able to prove how much Bob had belittled, neglected, and hurt me during our 2-year marriage. He was deemed at fault due to emotional abuse. Though it was a short marriage of only 2 years and I never had to worry about finances, I was able to secure a satisfactory amount in alimony and divorce Bob. After the divorce, I returned to my family home and took care of my father for a while. Fortunately, my father's recovery was smoother than expected, and he seems to be getting back to his regular life without any lingering effects. My father's workplace has told him he can return after a brief hiatus, and he's deeply grateful for that. Luckily, I got a job at the law firm that assisted me during my divorce. A friend of mine got married and was moving because of her husband's job. Thanks to my friend's recommendation and the lawyer who had seen my true nature during my interactions with Bob, the hiring process went smoothly. Thus, our family of 3 is slowly moving forward. Bob has completely lost his trustworthiness since our divorce. No matter how good-looking or worldly he might be, he's now recognized as a terrible person who can't treat others properly. It seems like no one wants anything to do with him now. A former colleague reached out, wanting to talk. Apparently, after Bob recovered from his injuries and returned to work, he was going around saying that I was a terrible woman who abandoned him when he was injured. Despite many people already knowing the real reason for our divorce, I'm astounded at how much he underestimates me. So, I asked my lawyer to send him a formal notice threatening to sue for defamation if he didn't correct his story. My friends also shared the real story, And those who were about to believe Bob's version now recognize him as a lying emotional abuser. Well, he seems to still have his job because he's competent, but I wonder how long he can keep it up in such a hostile environment. Right now, I'm not ready to look for someone new, but I want to find someone who truly cares for me next time. I want to show my parents a genuinely happy version of myself. For that day, I'll keep my head held high and continue moving forward.